I have never seen bodies as nearly perfect as theirs. As tall as palm trees, fair and reddish, they wear neither tunics nor kaftans. Every man wears a cloak, with which he covers half of his body, so that one arm is uncovered. They carry axes, swords, and daggers, and always have them to hand. They use Frankish swords with broad, ridged blades. That is a complimentary description of a group of Vikings from the Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Faldan, a scholar of Baghdad, who was sent by the Caliph on a diplomatic mission to the Bulgars in 921 AD. He first met these Norse warriors as he was traveling along Russia's steppes, and the reason he met them is because these Norsemen were by far the wealthiest civilization in Western Eurasia, particularly as Europe struggled to consolidate in the centuries after the collapse of the Roman Empire. So we think of Vikings as not doing that much except raiding coastlines and pillaging Irish monasteries, which they did, but they were also some of the most well-traveled people of the time. They went to the courts of Constantinople, the castles of England and Ireland, and they left their deepest mark by traveling across the Atlantic, where some would say the Vikings' legacy became the American dream. Today's guest is Arthur Herman. He's the author of the book The Viking Heart, and we're going to be discussing some of the unexplored legacies of the Vikings. In his book, he looks at archaeological discoveries and DNA research to show how the Vikings were much more multicultural than we would expect. And because of this, you see Vikings pop up in all sorts of unexpected places. They left behind graffiti in the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Some think they left behind a gigantic rune stone in Oklahoma dating back to 1012. So we're going to look at the origins of the Viking Age, the way they knit together early medieval European society and Eurasian society in unexpected ways, and how the Viking Age may have ended when they left behind their old beliefs and religion, but in many ways the Viking Age lives on to today. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Arthur Herman. Arthur, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here.
I've had a lot of listener interest in Vikings, and I field a lot of questions from listeners. Many of them are great. Some are a little bit odd, and I will lovingly welcome odd questions. One of them has to do with a listener asking about the Heavener runestone in Oklahoma, which I had never heard of. It turns out it's a runestone that some people believe was established by Vikings in 1012 as a boundary marker, only a few years after they arrived on the Atlantic coast. Others think that it was set up in the 19th century by a Scandinavian merry prankster who wrote in the runic lettering and made a false archaeological landmark. So to begin with this runestone, I think we both agree it's probably not legitimate, but why do you think the Vikings are so popular that many people would have cause to believe that this is true? And what does this say about our contemporary fascination with Viking culture?
Obviously the runestone is completely inauthentic. There's no possibility or any draw for Oklahoma for Viking adventures, even those who we know did cross the Atlantic and did land in North America and did establish temporary settlements, although they didn't stay terribly long. But I think it goes to the question of just people's willingness to believe that this extraordinary episode in history, the Viking Age, and these extraordinary people, the Vikings, were capable of anything. That they're sort of supermen and superwomen who, if they wanted to go to Oklahoma, could have. That doesn't seem so far-fetched, particularly in the way in which the Vikings have taken shape in popular culture, in television series, and in the way in which year after year, decade after decade, they keep coming up as something that people are always fascinated about, always interested in, and have this incredible draw. Like the dinosaurs. Vikings and dinosaurs are going to be with us for a long time. And the perennial fascination requires some explanation. And part of the reason I wrote the book, The Viking Heart, was to come up with some explanations as to why we're fascinated by them, not just as historical figures, but also, do they in a way convey certain kinds of a universal message to us, even if we're not of Scandinavian descent, even if we've never been to Scandinavia, or even if we've never read a book or seen a movie about the Vikings, there's something about them that catches our imagination. What is that? That's part of what I wanted to answer in writing the book.
And it does show that if you are an ancient civilization that has achieved a certain level of popularity, there will be some sort of pseudo-historical thesis that says that you came to America before Columbus, whether it's China, whether it's Rome. I've heard Carthaginians and now the Vikings as well. So, well, except with the Vikings, it's true.
and West Africans.
Yes, that's the other one.
That is something which the more credulous are always willing to look for evidence to support it. But of course, in the case of the Vikings, unlike the others, oh, and I forgot the Scots. We mustn't forget that
Right.
too. The idea that the Scots came here in the early 15th century. The difference being that in the case of the Vikings, they really did. The archaeological evidence is not doubtable. I mean, they did. The exact location of all of their settlements, we know there was one in Newfoundland, but the exact locations of others are still rather elusive. But it becomes pretty clear that they are part of the story of North America and of North American settlement, a small part, and a part which did not last until the coming of other Europeans in the 15th and 16th century. But they're part of the overall story. And what's interesting, Scott, about the Vikings from that point of view is that you have these people, Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, and Finns, who come from one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, of people of very small population compared to the rest of Europe or even other parts of the world, and yet who would have this disparate impact on their world, so sweeping and so important to the shaping of the future, that story also needs to be explained. In other words, not just what it is that fascinates us about the Vikings, but also about really understanding what their impact and legacy is for us today in the shaping of Europe, the shaping of the world. And I think one of the things that I do talk about in the book is the way in which we have to see the Vikings and their extraordinary voyages, not just across the Atlantic, but deep into the Mediterranean, along the river valleys into the Black Sea and across Russia, as well as all across the littoral of Northern Europe. We have to really see them as the precursors of globalization, and that the Viking trade routes that they laid down and that connected those parts of the world through Viking enterprise and the effort of Scandinavian marauders, yes, but also merchants and traders and eventually settlers, that these patterns are the foundation for what we think of as the modern global system.
And among some archaeologists I've talked to who are working in Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, plenty of Viking coinage have been found up in Sweden. Coinage from the Abbasid Caliphate has been found showing those trade networks, which we'll get into.
Thousands of Arab coins that made its way to Sweden. The settlement at Birka was sort of the main entrepot for that flow of treasure coming out of the Middle East into Northern Europe. And then much of it hoarded, which archaeologists like, because that allows them to recover the coins that were, buried 1,000 years ago. But a lot of it then recirculating out across the rest of Northern Europe and really filling an important need, which was after the fall of the Roman Empire, after the Eastern Empire became isolated from Western Europe by the Arab invasions, the Vikings became the means by which precious metals once again were able to circulate through Europe. And really, it was one of the things that really spelled the end of what we call Dark Age Europe. We think of the Viking warriors as the great, marauders and pillagers and robbers of the Dark Ages. But as traders, as entrepreneurs, they really also spelled the end to that period.
Well, let's set the stage for the Viking Age. The way that it's presented in a neat, concise way is around the year 700. There are some of the early coastal raids, whether on Irish monasteries or some early settlements that are set up by the Carolingian Empire. As Europe is slowly rebuilding itself, there's enough wealth that's being accumulated that it can be a target for pillaging. And that's something that we get from chronicles that are not written by the Vikings, but they're understood as outside pillagers. So what causes the Viking Age to begin, both for them as pillagers, but then also as traders? Are they picking up the scent of wealth opportunities and this pushes them out from Scandinavia? Is something else causing this? How would you characterize the beginning?
Well, this is one of the big questions. And what we have to say is there probably isn't one single factor that caused the Viking breakout from the Scandinavian peninsula. It was probably an accumulation of factors. One was the growth of population. As the Scandinavian population grew, outstripped the ability of very meager resources, including arable land, to support a growing population. They got to go somewhere, and they've got to find some kind of way in which to take care of all those extra sons. And one of them is to send them out on raiding expeditions on each other, by the way, as much as against non-Scandinavians and non-Vikings. One of the things we have to keep in mind is the Vikings as warriors, they hone their skills, they develop their strategy and tactics, which they take the rest of Europe with amazing success record. But those skills are honed and developed by the fighting among each other. Swedes against Norwegians, Norwegians against Danes, Danes against Swedes. It's the ongoing story all through the Viking Age and beyond, is the degree to which the Scandinavian peoples themselves are fighting constantly and grappling for power, grappling for dominion over the others. The big change that comes, you're right, there are early raids that take place at the end of the 8th century, the most famous being the raid on the monastery at Lindisfarne in 795. But those are only precursor for the real onslaught. And the real onslaught comes after the death of Charlemagne in 817, when the defenses of Northern Europe against raiders and attackers, not just Vikings, but also Germanic tribes like the Frisians, for example, who were kind of pre-Viking raiders and marauders and sea pirates. Those defenses weaken fatally. And the result is that every spring, boatloads of Danes and Norwegians set out from their homeland and venture forth to find places where they can pick up some easy loot because there's no one there to defend them. And for the next century and a half, really, there's no one who's quick enough on their feet to catch the Vikings because they have this amazing technology which gives them the element of surprise. We would call it today shock and awe, which is their sailing ships, the Viking longships, which could appear, as it were, almost out of nowhere, conduct a swift raid, load up the booty, including human captives for slave trading, which is a big part of the Viking economy and Viking international trade. Load up with your booty and your captives and be gone before local authorities even have an inkling that you've been there and have conducted the attack. This is a big problem for Europe for the next almost 200 years, is how to deal with these guys and women, because we know now both men and women participated in many of these expeditions, how to deal with them, how to stop the raids. And they really, in the end, could only get a handle on the Viking problem when the Vikings would attack major cities like Paris, like London, like Hamburg. And when those major raids came, it required more than, 5 or 6, or more than a dozen or a score of Viking longships, but hundreds of longships. Launching expeditions like this required skill in siege warfare on the part of the Vikings, but it also gave time to the defenders of Northern Europe, Charlemagne's heirs, to group forces, to put together an army, and to find some kind of way in which to halt the raids. But the freedom, the impunity with which the Vikings were able to conduct these raids is one of the things that I think everybody is in awe of with regard to the Vikings. But it's important to understand that this is a dynamic that sprang as much from the weakness of their opponents as from the martial prowess of the Vikings themselves. They were good. They weren't that good. When they faced really determined enemies and opponents, like King Alfred in England, they didn't fare so well.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I've taught courses on early Islamic history, I've heard some scholars compare them to the early Muslim period. This doesn't go with the traditional religious account, of course, but the secular historical account, that you have forces that can strike lightning fast. If they can target weaker settlements, then they'll go after it. If the defenses are stronger, then they'll simply avoid it or go around it. And they're also, at least in the early Islamic period, they're dealing with a wealthy but largely weakened civilization, which are the Byzantine and also the Persian empires that, due to disease, due to warfare, other things, make it possible for them to really pick off a lot of the wealth there.
And in both cases, what we see is that what makes these attacks more than just a major annoyance is that eventually the raiders and marauders become, number one, merchants and traders, and then they become rulers on their own right. And so by the 11th century, right, by let's say 200 years after the heyday of the tip and run Viking raids era, you see Viking chieftains, kings from Norway and Denmark, establishing themselves as rulers in the countries and places that they've overrun. The best example being England, with King Canute the Great, who comes to the throne in the early 11th century. We can look at William the Conqueror, the descendant of Norseman raiders in Normandy, and also in Russia, where we have Swedish adventurers who establish a dynasty and establish rule and really create a political unity in the heart of what becomes the medieval kingdom of Russia. They graduate from raiders to traders to rulers in their own right. And my book really spells out the stages by which that takes place and how at each stage they manage to transform Europe, but also transform Western civilization by the role that they come to play as rulers and as makers of the map of Europe, not just as, marauding tribesmen and maritime robbers.
The raiders to traders transition is interesting. It sounds like the Godfather Part 2, where the Corleone family is trying to go legitimate, and what has happened to mafia families. Because if you run an empire and it's legal, then there's just a lot of difficulties you don't have to deal with if you're dealing with the criminal world.
You want to carry the analogy further? You could even get to a Godfather 3, which is when rulers like Canute the Great and William the Conqueror seek legitimacy from, in this case, the Catholic Church. And they embrace Christianity and embrace their alliance with the Catholic Church. Roger Giscard also, another Norman adventurer in the south of France, who find through the relationship with the Catholic Church a source of legitimacy and stability and power, which really helps to not only stabilize their own rule, but also helps to stabilize government and civilization in medieval Europe at the same time.
To look at the issue of their trade networks more specifically, we had mentioned different places where they appear in Constantinople. And I was mentioning off the air before we recorded that something that people love when they go into the Hagia Sophia Church in Istanbul, Constantinople, which was the largest church for a millennium, is on the second floor, there is in one place Viking graffiti. And there's a bit of plexiglass over the marble where it's protected, and there's a sign next to it, and it's just runic script that somebody carved in there. Maybe it's a member of the Varangian Guard or
who are recruited from the Scandinavian kingdoms, the Varangian Guard.
So could you give an overview of where were these trade networks? And in your book, you mentioned some DNA mapping, and you're able to chart this in a way that until very recently hasn't been possible with what researchers have been doing. So what is the extent of their trade networks?
Well, they really reached from the Eastern Mediterranean. And you mentioned Hagia Sophia. We can also point to the Norse graffiti that we find in the Piraeus, the port of Athens. There's another famous monument, which is a stone lion on which some Viking mercenaries, again, carved, their initials, carved a tribute to one of their fellow warriors who had fallen in battle. So you have trading networks that extend from the Eastern Mediterranean that flow all the way across to the Western Mediterranean through the Straits of Gibraltar, up to the British Isles, and then across to Scandinavia itself, right? The Denmark and Norway, to Sweden, down from Sweden through the Baltic region, through the river valleys there, the Dnieper and the Dniester, all the way down to eventually Constantinople. So a great circle of trading networks, as well as raiding networks. Certainly in the early stages, that was the case. Sometimes you arrive to loot a town on the Mediterranean coast. Sometimes you arrive to do some business. It's a matter of choice, a matter of whim on the part of the Vikings involved in this. But then, of course, those trading networks reach out from there. And we know that the trading networks reach out from Constantinople eastward to Baghdad. There's still some debate about whether Vikings or their descendants, the Russian descendants, actually made it all the way to Baghdad. My guess is at some point they probably did by the 11th century, and then reach westward, first to the Faroe Islands, then to the next point west to Iceland, then Greenland, and then eventually around the year 1000, they reach the coast of North America. And these are not just scattered settlements. We know that, for example, narwhal tusks harvested in Greenland make their way back to Scandinavia and also to the British Isles for use in the luxury trade and crafts and so on, including those very famous chessmen, the ivory chessmen that everyone marvels at the British Museum. I used illustration of one of them in the book, as a matter of fact. But we know from DNA tests that the ivory of those chessmen came from narwhal tusks harvested in Greenland. At the same time, the trading networks come to include settlements. And over time, as the Vikings began to conduct business and need to repair their ships on the long voyages involved, particularly across the North Atlantic. And that's where we think ultimately the settlements and the settlement and archaeological site we found in Newfoundland probably was basically a boat repair shop where Vikings could land their ships, careen them, clean them, carry out repairs, if necessary, sit out the winter, and then set it out again for home in the spring. That these settlements became much more extensive and over the decades really became part of the local population in ways that we really didn't understand until the science of DNA really opened up the channels for more research and for understanding, but just how much Vikings became not just temporary visitors to places in Ireland and Scotland and Northern England, but became part of the population, intermarried, and became a permanent part of the DNA profile of the populations in these places. And I always warn people now that if you think of yourself as being of Irish descent or Scottish descent, you might want to have your DNA checked, because it may turn out that a big chunk of that Irish ancestry turns out to be Nordic or Scandinavian.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. Maybe that explains when people are doing Ancestry.com, there's always 1% of something that never makes any sense. I'm 1% Polynesian. If you have a population of people that are traveling all over the world or throughout Eurasia at a very early time, well, I mean, this could open up all sorts of different possibilities there.
Well, there's another point, too, that this DNA research, I think, really illustrates, Scott, and that is the degree to which the Vikings themselves were never interested in or concerned about what we would call kind of racial or ethnic purity in any kind of way. The whole history of the Vikings flies in the face of the way in which the Vikings were treated in the late 19th century and the early 20th century by groups like the Nazis, for example, who thought of them as being the sort of exclusive Nordic Aryan race whose martial skills and adventurous spirit was somehow, inbred as part of their Aryan or Nordic ancestry. What we know from the DNA test now is that the Vikings themselves were made up of all groups of people of different backgrounds and different ethnic origins here. That the real question was, and so on, can you fight? Can you carry a sword or a spear? Do you get seasick on long voyages or not? And do you have a good head for bargains if we're doing business on the other side of the North Sea or the other side of the Baltic or the other side of the North Atlantic? And again, what DNA shows us is it really undermines the kind of racist myths about the Vikings that I think has been one of the unfortunate aspects of the interest in Vikings that still, I'm afraid to say, still persists in some quarters today with neo-Nazi groups. But as my book shows and so on, the story of the Vikings is very different. It's a far more, if you like, use a current term, it's a more inclusive history than those accounts show. Inclusive, including the role of women, as well as the role of people who were not necessarily of Norwegian or Danish or Swedish blood.
Yeah, Nazi ethnographic research will make your head spin, because if they really were consistent and looking for what is a pure Aryan people that hold on to an Indo-European civilization and have remained mostly intact ethnically, I mean, if you're looking for the closest example, it'd be something like the Romani population, which went to concentration camps. So plenty of contradictions floating around. Looking on the Western expansion as they're island hopping from England to Ireland, Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and then off to Canada. This is a little bit aside from the Viking story, but I've looked in other episodes at the age of exploration and setting up these far-flung settlements. Is it accurate to say that at the end of the day, human exploration and settlement and colonization and the spread of humanity, our adventuring spirit, is all about collecting and selling silly nonsense to rich people back home, whether it's fur skins in the 1700s to rich Parisian women, or ivory tusk from narwhals or walruses, or it's spices from India, so wealthy Genoese merchant families can have cinnamon and cumin on their food. And I mean, are we never going to colonize Moon or the Mars unless there's some silly nonsense we can find to sell to billionaires back home?
Well, I think that's part of the reason why people are talking about colonization of the Moon and Mars, asteroids, right? In fact, I have on my bookshelf right over here a book about asteroid mining and about the future that lies with that. There's probably no doubt about it. But it wasn't what we would consider to be simply luxury items that drew the Viking. We also have to, and as I explain in my book, it's an aspect of the Viking story which we just have to confront and deal with as an historical fact. And that was that the Vikings became the great slave traders of medieval Europe. And one of the reasons why they ranged so far and wide and established the settlements that they did, certainly in the earlier period, right? In the heyday of the Vikings, in the 8th and 9th centuries, one of the reasons they did that was to meet the unceasing demand for enslaved populations, particularly in the Muslim world. That was one of the key aspects of trade with the Muslim world, was the exchange of human captives for silver and for precious metal. It's a world in which everything that had to get done involving human labor eventually inevitably involved using enslaved people. Everybody accepted that. Everybody understood that. And the Vikings simply found a way to make a lot of money and to make themselves important middlemen in Europe in that ongoing slave trade. So, yeah, I mean, that was definitely a big part of when the Vikings came to realize not just how vulnerable Europe was in terms of stealing loot from monasteries, wine and foodstuffs from settlements in northern France or in Germany, but also the way in which you could round up, a dozen or so, 20 or 30 human captives, load them onto the longboat and head off where you knew there would be a good market for them.
Well, I'd like to get your take on the book on the Newfoundland settlement, because a question I see a lot on history questions people ask are, well, why didn't the Vikings settle in North America? What if they had done that and we'd had a Scandinavian North America? And my speculation is, well, they didn't come for the same reasons that Columbus did, looking for a direct trade route to the Indies or to China. And they didn't come to set up a colony the way that pilgrims do. And also they didn't have really solid geographic knowledge of what the New World even was. So on the ground, who even knows what they understood they were on, whether it was simply another island as part of their chain or whatnot. So what were their reasons for arriving as far as they did? And why didn't they set up a permanent colony or continue to go further? Did it just not meet their aims as a trade network or some other reason?
Well, I wish we could ask them.
Yeah.
Fascinating to talk to Leif Erikson right. and his fellow mariners about if you got here and so on, why didn't you stay? as they did in Greenland. You see, Greenland is a good example of that. Greenland is a good example of where they arrived, established settlements, and stayed for a long time. I mean, the last traces of the Viking or Scandinavian settlement in Greenland really come to an end in the 1300s. The 1400s, it's really gone. But they show a lot of staying power. I think one of the key reasons is that they didn't really find very much there in North America and in trade with the native peoples there that really satisfied the markets that they had established in Europe already. There was certainly plenty of timber. Again, one of the reasons for establishing, a boat repair settlement, because you had plenty of trees around with which to replace masts and repair hull or make new oars or do the other kinds of things that boat repair required. But hey, they got plenty of lumber back in Scandinavia. They weren't short of anything there. I think we also mustn't underestimate the degree to which hostility from the indigenous population may have also tipped their hand in all of this as well. We're talking about handfuls of settlers, handfuls of explorers who get out there and who just may have found that dealing with the local tribes simply wasn't worth the effort, and the degree to which the confrontation and hostility was such that it just didn't make sense to stick around. But we don't know. It's a really good question. And at some point, maybe if we do find additional settlements, if archaeology makes it possible and new modern archaeological research allows us to find additional settlements besides the one at Ons-au-Meadow in Newfoundland, if we do find that, maybe there'll be some clues to answer your question.
When you talked earlier about DNA mapping, have you seen anything that suggests how, when they're in these far-flung outposts, there are many who just simply assimilate into the population, whether it's among Inuits or it's with the native populations in Greenland, in Newfoundland, and elsewhere?
Well, the DNA research being what it is, my impression is that in the case of Greenland, with DNA samples of Inuit population there, you don't see much sign of intermarriage. That it seems more likely that the settlement simply withered and died out. And maybe in the end, the Inuits overran it and destroyed it. We just don't really know. The archaeological evidence is kind of ambiguous about that. So I think in the case of the British Isles, however, we see plenty of intermarriage and settlement. And one of the key reasons being there you have not just opportunities for trade, but also opportunities for ownership of land. And in the end, nothing draws a Scandinavian like possibility of big acres to farm, big acres to plant your livestock, big acres which you can divide among your sons and daughters and sons-in-law as part of their inheritance. And in the end, I think we have to say that's what really draws Scandinavian settlers 9 centuries after the Viking to America, is above all else the issue of religious liberty, very important. The issue of looking for economic opportunity in the 19th century when Scandinavia had really fallen behind the rest of Europe in terms of industrialization and urbanization. There was plenty of draw to go someplace where you could find more economic opportunity you could find at home. But the biggest draw of all, as I explain in the book, in the second half of the book, it really talks about the Scandinavian diaspora in the modern era that matches in so many ways the diaspora in the Viking Age and in the medieval period. That the diaspora in the modern age is driven by the desire for land to farm, which there's just never enough. There's never enough for the population back home to give them that possibilities.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Well, I'd like to get to the main theme of your book, which is in the title right there, The Viking Heart. And something you say is that the Scandinavian experience has universal meaning, and that Vikings' lives teach us a lesson on how shared culture and community can empower us in the midst of disruptive change and chaos. So these are things that I always like to look at with this show of history, it's a laboratory of human experience, that our social conditions are radically different from those in the past. But in terms of our hardware as humans, it hasn't changed significantly over thousands or tens of thousands of years. So what would you say there, the Viking experience or the ethos, what is that you think can carry on and be instructive today?
Yeah, I think that's very well put, that the hardware hasn't changed. But what can change and what alters is the software. And that is the mindset that we bring and the cultural ecosystem under which we operate. And for various reasons, I explain in the book, the cultural ecosystem that really develops in the pre-Viking age and that really produces the efflorescence of Viking culture of the Viking age is this peculiar combination of, on the one hand, given the inhospitable environment, right, of those Nordic lands, that survival is about group survival. You cannot make it on your own. You need to have family, community, the village, the tribe working together in order to make sure everyone doesn't, number one, freeze to death or starve to death, because arable land is so scarce, and because fishing is in the end, a communal activity. It takes teamwork to gather the harvest from the sea that keep your community, keep your family fed. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there's also enormous room that was left for individuals to go out and look for opportunities in which to bring back wealth to benefit the group, the community. And that's exactly what the Vikings did. Those boatloads of Norwegian and Danish sons and daughters who went out and so on, they went out to gather wealth, to gather loot, and the material goods they needed to bring back home. It was to come back home as a way in which to enrich the lives of family and community. And that balance between, on the one hand, of the recognizing the need that we are all in this together, and that community and the values that hold a community together, that grow out of experience, right? Out of the experience of what works and what doesn't for group solidarity, balanced by a recognition of the need that individuals have to pursue their own dreams, to pursue their own path, as well as their obligation to the others in that community. That's hardwired into them by that culture. That what you have is a very potent combination, what I would call a human skill set, cultural package that I call the Viking Heart, but which we see demonstrated again and again through the history of Scandinavia and the Scandinavian and Nordic nations, which passed on to we're the lucky recipients here in the United States, because it came over with the Scandinavian American immigrants who flooded into this country in the 19th century and the early 20th century. But it's one which also, too, this brings us back where we started, Scott. It brings us back to why we're still so fascinated by the Vikings, because they had that dual character, didn't they? On the one hand, they are these enterprising, adventurous, going out to risk it all for even to the edge of the unknown. But at the same time, they are a people, their experiences rooted in a time and a place and a community. They're part of a community that they serve and within which they operate as part of family, as part of their village, as part of their tribe here. And that kind of balance between those two aspects of human character is something that's celebrated in the Nordic sagas, that carries on into European literature in the 19th century, inspired by those sagas, which is really the only literary remains we have of the Viking experience. We talked about the runes. The runes were all about graffiti. They're not a way in which they're not record keeping. It's not a form of writing for record keeping or recording chronicles and so on. As you pointed out, we have to depend on others' chronicles to figure out what the Vikings were doing and what they're up to. But the runes are a form of expressing that inner, the individuality. This is my name. This is my comb. This is my grave, the grave of my parents or the grave of my wife. That's what the runes did. But the Norse sagas carry the literary remains of that Viking culture. And they come to inspire so much of romantic literature in the 19th century, as I talk about at the end of the book, whether you're talking about the operas of Wagner, right, the Ring cycle, which is almost entirely taken out of the Nordic saga tales and heroes and gods and Valhalla and all the characters and conflicts that arise from that. But also the world of J.R. Tolkien. Lord of the Rings wouldn't exist without the Norse sagas. And J.R. Tolkien was a man who was fascinated by Old Norse, fascinated by the culture and experience of the Vikings, and he built it into our own modern culture as well, whether you're talking about, and I talk about at the end of the book, the links between that world that Tolkien built out of the Norse sagas that carries on to the world of Star Wars, that carries on to the world of our superheroes, that carries on to the whole fabric of the way in which we think about heroism and think about sacrifice, but sacrifice in defense of the community, in defense of family, in defense of those we know and those we trust. That how important is that as part of our own modern pop culture? Its roots lie with the Vikings. And I think if we come back to our question that we started with, why are people so fascinated by the Vikings perennially? It's because we recognize that they contain something that appeals to us as human beings. The sense of adventure, the sense of taking on risk, taking on the dangers that surround us, but setting out with a stout heart, with a sense of purpose and direction, but also at the same time not losing sight of our links to our home or to our community and to those we've left behind. That's what the Viking story, I think, in the end is all about. And it carries through today. And one of the reasons I wanted this book to come out now is because I think our identification with and our need for that sense of the freedom, right? Freedom embedded in community. That's really the future. And that's what I really wanted. That's where the future lies. And that's really where I wanted this story of the Vikings to connect to.
Well, going back to the beginning of our discussion, the Heavener runestone isn't any more realistic, but at least listeners can see how it's plausible to many people that the civilization that does travel so far and wide could have done that. So, well, there's a lot more to unpack in the story. And for listeners who want to check it out, the name of the book is The Viking Heart, How Scandinavians Conquered the World. Arthur, thank you for joining us.
It's been a great pleasure, Scott. Thank you.
That is all for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening.